This is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today we are going to discuss Red-White in Lord of the Rings Limited. The notes are available to follow along at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. And getting into it, Red-White is basically like an average performing archetype, both in terms of like how often people draft it relative to other color combinations and its win rate. Very middle of the road. Not, in my opinion, something that you need to try to avoid drafting or something that you should really like go out of your way to draft. I think that most of the time that you draft it, it's going to be because you saw Theoden at some point early in the draft. That's the 3-mana uncommon 2/3 human that when a human enters gives a creature double strike until end of turn. That's not the actual best uncommon in the set for red-white, that being Eomer, the 5/4 haste that makes a human when it attacks most of the time. But it is a very, very, very strong uncommon that, of course, puts you solidly in red-white. Barring that, Shadowfax can fill a similar role. That's the 5-mana 4/4 haste horse that can put a creature with less power from your hand onto the battlefield tapped and attacking when it attacks. Shadowfax is much weaker than Theoden, but still stronger than replacement level commons. If you have like a not especially strong early pack, then it can make sense to speculate on Shadowfax and move into red-white. I mean, obviously, of course, red and white could just be the open colors and you can end up there without like a signpost card pointing you there. But the most common reason that I'm going to be like trying to be red-white from early in the draft is if I have a red-white gold card. It could be either of the uncommons, or it could be the rare Eowyn, the 4-mana 3/4 haste that exiles a creature with more power than it when it enters the battlefield, and then gives your legendary creatures protection until end of turn from the colors of the thing you exiled. So that's what's going to put you in red-white. And then red-white is basically like a typical wide aggro deck. Like you are going to have a lower, more creature-heavy curve than most of your opponents. You're going to be looking to get in early damage, and then you're not unlikely to find that, in the mid-game, your opponent has larger creatures than you, but you're in a spot where if you wanted, you could attack with all your creatures, maybe lose something and push a bunch of damage, and you have to decide whether you want to make that attack or not. And I think that there's no good rule on like when or how often you're going to want to sacrifice a creature to push damage. It's going to totally depend on the matchup, your deck, the situation. To the extent that you can, while you're drafting your deck, you sort of want to think about whether you're the sort of deck that wants to err toward like sacrificing creatures to push damage, or not sacrificing creatures to play more of like a big game kind of game plan, where you like go wide and then maybe have some kind of like overrun or anthem type effect that's going to make all of your creatures bigger for like a good attack later. So those are kind of the two different philosophies you could have about like how a like wide aggro deck fundamentally works. Are you just trying to like send in all of your creatures and some of them will die and that's okay because you'll push damage? Or are you trying to like build up to like a single big turn? And red-white kind of has the tools to do both of those things, but the like single big turn, like pump all your guys tools are mostly not great. We're talking about things like Esquire of the King and Now for Wrath, Now for Ruin, that both have the problem that they only give your creatures one additional power, which isn't really that like game changing. Birkenbrand, the 3/3 for 4 uncommon human that gives all your creatures +1/+0 whenever a human enters, is kind of the best way to do that like explosive like trumpet blast overrun type plan, especially if you have multiple Rally the Hornbergs and you can potentially like hold one of them until you have Birkenbrand and then like play Birkenbrand and Rally and like make your whole team huge. And Yeah, the Eagles are another, Eagles of the North are another good pump your whole team effect, although again, it's only +1 power. All of that stuff kind of points more toward wanting to do the like push damage as your end game rather than like sacrifice creatures, push damage, get them low, rather than the like go wide, make your creatures big, finish them off. And then in addition to that, you have the ring, which is a good way to like push the last few points a lot of the time, especially if you have these 1/1 tokens, and especially if you can get the ring up to high levels. And then you also have access to Improvised Club, which is a very good way to just like deal the final points to your opponent, especially if you're like in a spot where you're like alpha striking and then sacrificing a creature that they blocked who's going to die anyway. Which means that I think more often your red white deck is going to be like the pure aggro push damage sort rather than the like super big game go wide overrun sort. But both are hypothetically possible. Often, when I'm in that spot where it's like, okay, is it time to attack with all my creatures or not? The decision is kind of complicated by the fact that I have a ring bearer. So, like, I can attack with that one creature safely and push damage anyway. And then it's like, okay, am I happy to just like get this little bit of damage and play kind of like the black white game plan where you just like send a ring bearer in over and over? Or do I want to like attack with the rest of the creatures, also lose something and push some damage? And like, again, there's not a good general answer to that. You just kind of have to figure out like whether the end is in sight. Like, if you start throwing away creatures, can you see the finish line? And like, if not, like, how much are you losing? How much does it set you back on trying to play a longer game? The more improvised club type reach you have, the more often you're going to want to like sacrifice creatures for damage, while the more, you know, Erkenbrands and Eagles and stuff like that you have, the better it might be to play it slow. So you just want to be thinking about the contents of your deck while you're making those decisions, and then also thinking about the contents of your deck with the expectation that you will be making those decisions in your games while you're drafting to, you know, maybe like lean one way or another so that your deck is more reliably going to draw cards toward one of those plans or the other, so that you're better informed about which kind of game you want to play. You know, if you have like a mix of like clubs and Erkenbrand and Eagles and stuff, then you're going to get to the spot where you're like, okay, am I supposed to make this attack? I don't know. If I draw one of these 3 cards, it'll be a lot better if I do. If I draw one of these 3 cards, it'll be a lot better if I don't. It's fine to just have a mix of cards and sometimes be able to draw the right cards. And also, you know, if you have a lot of tempt, you can discard the wrong ones to try to find the right ones. But it does help to just be thinking about that kind of stuff during the draft. As far as like individual cards, Rally the Hornburg, the 2 mana make 2 humans and give your humans haste is the clear best common in this archetype by a lot. Arguably, you know, the best common, or at least the best red common in the set in general. Where there's an argument, it would be someone suggesting that Smite the Deathless is better. In red-white, I don't think there's a question. Rally is the best by a lot. You should basically just always take Rally over any other commons, regardless of like your curve or any other real considerations. Like this is a Rally deck if you can get enough rallies for it to be a Rally deck. Similarly, Eomer, the 5/4 haste for 5, is the best uncommon, and you should take it over all the other uncommons and over almost every rare. The only like exception, the only cards you should take over Eomer in this archetype are like Horn of Gondor, Anduril, the mythic sword, Palantir, the mythic scry artifact, and rare Eowyn, the 3/4 haste exile creature. As I mentioned, Theoden's great, but Theoden's, you know, not top tier. It's not as good as like Eomer or Fear Fire Foes, even if you are in this archetype already. And there are a lot of other like top tier uncommons that you should take over speculating on Theoden if you're not already solidly red-white. And then Shadowfax is good, like it's better than most commons, but it's not as good as the top red uncommons. But like I said earlier, they're both like good reasons to draft red white if you're, open at the point where you see them. If you do have Shadowfax, you really want to prioritize Eagles of the North. Shadowfax putting Eagles of the North into play is very real and very worth building around. If I have a single Shadowfax, I would take Eagles over all but the top commons because the cost of putting Eagles in my deck is so small. Like they're generally going to be good in my red white deck anyway. And if I have several of them, then it's really easy to just like have a game where I, set up Shadowfax into Eagles, given that Shadowfax costs less mana than Eagles anyway. I'm not really going out of my way to do this. And then you have a like really, really good often game winning attack. So, as I mentioned, even if you are thinking that you're more like the wide deck, you have a bunch of token makers, you should still almost always avoid Now for Wrath, Now for Ruin, and even Esquire the King. The cards are just not very good. Erkenbrand, the human that I mentioned earlier, the 4-mana 3/3 that pumps your guys and a human comes into play, has like solid stats, but not exceptional. It can definitely steal some games if you have it, especially if you have multiples of it in your deck. You really want to think about how you're playing your cards and whether you want to like sandbag some cheap humans for some explosive turns. If adding more creatures to the board is not likely to immediately affect combat on either side, it's totally reasonable to just keep some cheap creatures in your hand for more Erkenbrand triggers. I suspect that like the stats on Erkenbrand are slightly lower than they could be due to players not making that kind of play. I definitely think it's worth looking for. On the subject of this, like, fork in your strategy about, like, well, now my opponent has a good blocker. Am I supposed to keep attacking or not? I don't want to overstate how much like that should be determining your like thought process or how you're drafting or like what portion of games go that way or like how much you need to build around that decision point, because I do think that like when things go really well, your opponent never gets to that point. Like they're never stable. If you're making like this attack where you're losing something, it's a spot where like your opponent's either trading with something that would do 1,000,000 damage to them or chumping something that would do a ton of damage to them, or they're like going to low single digit life total and like eating a 1/1 and taking a big hit because you have some kind of like explosive extra creature that like added a bunch of power to an attack, like Eomer or Theoden, or Erkenbrand. The reason that red white is good is not just that you have this like low curve early stuff that can push damage like Rally. It's that you have a good density of like explosive mid-game creatures that have an immediate impact that make blocking hard. And it's not just like Shadowfax and Theoden and Eomer. You can get a similar effect with even like East Farthing Farmer, the 2/3 that makes a food and pumps something until end of turn, can give you a safe attack where you wouldn't otherwise have one. And so, like, your good red white draws, your opponent's never going to stabilize. You're just going to run them over. So, uh, there's an argument that taking too much of the like, what do I do after my opponent stabilizes, like prioritizing clubs or eagles or whatever too highly is sacrificing too much from your like core aggro, but not like rock bottom curve aggro, but like smooth curve aggro plan where you just like, curve out like 2 through 5 and then they're dead or whatever. So anyway, more on just like general card evaluation stuff. After Rally at the Hornburg, the commons you're looking for are Errand Rider of Gondor, the 3-mana 3/2 that draws a card, and then if you don't have a legend, puts a card back. Protector of Gondor, the 4-mana 3/3 that makes a 1/1, and Smite the Deathless, the 2-mana red removal spell over everything else. Those things are all super, super, super close in quality. Just take them as your curve or the needs of your deck dictate. If you have a lot of legends, take Errand Rider more highly. If your curve's a little high or you lack interaction, take Smite a little more highly. If you don't have 4s and you do have like go wide type stuff, then Protector more highly. And then beyond that, you're looking for just like other, solid commons, Improvised Club, the sack a thing deal 4 instant, Rohirrim Lancer, the 1/1 menace that tempts when it dies, East Farthing Farmer, the hobbit that makes a food, the 2/3 that pumps something, Relentless Rohirrim, the 4 mana 4/3 that tempts when it enters, Haradrim Spearmaster, the 2/3 reach that pumps human beginning of combat, Quarrel's End, the draw 2 discard 1 make a human, and then for 2 drops, Battlescarred Goblin and Eastmark Cavalier. That's the 2/2 goblin that does damage to a blocker, and the 2/2 Vigilance human that kills orcs that it fights. In general, I don't think that you want to prioritize non-Rally at the Hornburg and Smite the Deathless 2 drops very highly outside of like good, uncommon, and rare 2 drops, just because there are a lot of common 2 drops, and like the best ones are not substantively better than the weaker ones. So like you're just going to get enough 2 drops, and you want to prioritize the good 3 and 4 drops, because there's just a larger gap in quality between having like the right ones and the wrong ones there. Also, with Protector of Gondor, on the subject of like things that make you value stuff more highly, obviously Erkenbrand and Theoden are both great reasons to value Protector of Gondor more highly. Or if you're just playing like the human equipment, the +2/+1 equipment that has equip human 1, Durindon Blade or whatever. That card, I don't think you should look to play, but I think it's acceptable to play one if you have like a lot of tokens and you're looking for a way to like make them a little more significant. Escape from Orthanc, the +1/+3 untap flying trick, is also good. So are Eagles and Oliphant, and Warbeast of Gorgoroth, the 5 mana 5/4 that when a creature with 4 or more power dies, you amass 2. A lot of random playables, pretty much the standard, good red and white cards. Nothing too surprising there. As with most decks in this format, I think you'll generally perform better if you have a solid tempt package, but you want to pay attention to, how much tempt you have as the draft is going. If you get to the middle of the draft and it doesn't look like you're on track to have at least 5 tempt cards at a minimum, you should consider just forgoing tempt entirely. If your card quality is high without it, like you really don't need tempt in this archetype. You're looking to play short games, which means that you're not going to like draw a lot of cards to find all the tempt anyway, and you're not going to like have enough different turns for like the looting to matter. Like if the game ends on turn 6, like tempt just doesn't matter. Getting into overplayed cards that you should probably consider avoiding. This again is just looking at 17 lands, how often cards are played relative to how well they perform. Now for Wrath, Now for Ruin, the 4 mana sorcery that puts a +1/+1 counter on all of your creatures and gives them vigilance and tempts. Slip on the Ring, the flicker that tempts you. Banish from Edoras, the 5 mana exile sorcery that costs less mana if the creature is tapped. And Took Reaper, the 2/1 that tempts when it dies. All underperform and are played a little too frequently in red-white. And then cards that are not played very much relative to how well they do that you should maybe consider playing instead. Escape from Orthanc, the +1/+3 trick. East Farthing Farmer, the 2/3 that makes a food. Warbeast of Gargaroth, the 5/4 for 5. And Breaking the Fellowship, the 2 mana, a creature deals damage to another creature, and then you tempt spell. Interesting note there that, while Slip on the Ring and Took Reaper are overplayed, Breaking the Fellowship is underplayed, which means that it's not that like tempt consistently and reliably underperforms so much as like people aren't necessarily even putting the right tempt cards in their red-white decks. That wraps it up. That covers what I had to say about this going in. So now I'm going to turn it over to Twitch chat to help me round this out. While I'm waiting for that, I want to thank my newest patron. Excited to have another new patron, Theo McCoy. Thank you very much. And, suggest again to all the other listeners that if you are not a patron and you've been enjoying this podcast and want to help out, please consider checking out the Patreon, joining the Patreon, and or leaving reviews or just sharing links with your friends. All that stuff really helps out the podcast. All right, so questions. Is it possible that breaking gets played in some decks with more tempt other cards than the other two? Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't know what the specific data set looks like. Maybe people are playing Took Reaper just like as a 2-drop when they don't have a lot of tempt, and they're only playing Breaking the Fellowship when they really mean it. If it's true that that's happening, that could account for that difference. But I don't have any clear reason to believe that's what's going on. Breaking the Fellowship does benefit somewhat from the fact that, like, you probably aren't playing that much removal, so it's more likely that your opponent's just gonna like have some creatures, and they're likely to be like leaving them back. Also, like, the fact that you might be like attacking with a bunch of little guys might let like Breaking the Fellowship plus one of your guys combine to kill like a larger like maybe you'll get to kill their best creature instead of their second best creature or something like that. How do you evaluate / how often do you play Shire Sheriff in red white? Found it was very easy to obtain tokens. I think Shire Sheriff, that's the 2 mana 2/2 vigilance that lets you sacrifice a token to exile something for as long as you control Shire Sheriff, is good to prioritize since, worst case, it's pretty similar to Eastmark Cavalier. It's not a human, it doesn't have the orc text. If you don't sacrifice something to it, it is worse, but not disastrously worse. And if you have Shire Sheriff, I do think that you should a little bit more highly prioritize East Farthing Farmer so that you can sacrifice a food rather than sacrificing a creature token. But even if your tokens are just 1/1s, there are going to be some spots where it's like risky to sacrifice a 1/1 to exile your opponent's big creature, because then if they kill the Shire Sheriff, you're just down an extra creature. But if your opponent has an amass army, even if it's only a 2/2, and sometimes it's going to be quite a bit bigger than that, sacrificing a human to get rid of it is going to like guaranteed trade up on value considerably. And I think that like those spots, or just the spots where maybe your opponent has a removal spell, but you've cleared a large blocker for a turn, are enough to make Shire Sheriff like considerably better than the other commons. Obviously, if it's like late in the draft and you're really bad at making tokens, then you can skip Shire Sheriff. But I think that early in the draft, I'm going to, be interested in taking it and drafting around it. But I'm also, when I'm playing the games, not going to be like married to the idea that I have to like find a way to get value out of it. And like if I don't have another 2-drop, I'm certainly just going to cast it on 2. Do I think red or white uncommons or rares are the only way to move into red white? No, I mean, like, I think that both Rally at the Hornburg and Errand Rider of Gondor are commons that I'm looking to pick up. And if I just like see a bunch of, some mix of those and Protector of Gondor and Smite the Deathless, you could end up here just by like taking good commons, and those commons happen to be in red white. Like, I think that the red and white, like the gold uncommons and the gold rares, are the thing that is going to make me like fight to find a way to get into red white. But just like following signals and taking the best cards in the pack can, basically lead you to any 2 colors. Is Horn of the Mark completely unplayable? Would a 2/1 be would a +2/+1 blade be a better inclusion? I don't know. I know that Horn of the Mark has bad stats overall, but I also know that it's like a colorless artifact that can easily be very wrong for your deck. And I know that, for example, Elven Chorus also has very bad stats, but I've had really good experiences with it in the right deck. So similarly, I could imagine that if, for example, you have a lot of Rohirrim Lancers, the 1/1 menace creature, that Horn of the Mark gets a lot better. If, in addition to having a bunch of Rohirrim Lancers that make it easier to attack with 2 creatures, for those who don't know, Horn of the Mark is the 2 mana artifact that if you attack with 2 or more creatures, you can look at the top 5 cards of your library and put a creature from among them into your hand. So if, in addition to having some, cheap evasive creatures that are going to make it easier to trigger it, you also have really high value creatures to find. Any of these good legends we've been talking about, for example, or just Protector of Gondor that's going to be a high impact card that's going to make it easier to trigger again. I could certainly see having a deck where I wanted to try it for the mark. I think that you should be very careful with it. I think you shouldn't play it unless your deck is unless you have reason to believe that your deck is considerably better positioned for it than the average deck that would think about playing it. But I could certainly see it having its moments. If I ever had a successful red-white deck that wasn't human synergy based, I have not personally played red-white all that much, so I don't remember for sure. I think that a vast majority of red-white decks will use some human synergies, but I could see one that was more reliant on legend synergy, for example, where some of them happen to be humans, but that's not exactly the main thing going on, especially if this is mountains, plains, and multiple great halls, red, white, and friends kind of deck. Or a heavy tempt deck where your cards care about tempt more than they care about humans, I guess. How do you feel about the white saga that tutors up legends in this deck? That's the white rare War of the Last Alliance, I think. 3 and a white. Twice you search for a legend, then all of your creatures get double strike and the ring tempts you. I think that card is fantastic. I think it is way better if you have Shadowfax. I think, find whatever, and then next chapter find Shadowfax, and then play Shadowfax and use Shadowfax to put whatever into play, and then get double strike the following turn is really, really good. So, yeah, I think War of the Last Alliance is, a rare that I would take over all but the top uncommons, and very much look to play it in red-white. I'm not really concerned with taking a turn off to draw cards, because I think that you more than make up for it on your double strike turn. And since the red-white gold cards are so good, it's very, very easy to end up in a spot where you have really good creatures to find with it, and specifically where you have good creatures that combine well, and being able to find 2 of them gives you a combo. So yeah, I'm very high on that saga in red-white in particular, and also in general. Boris, I've run into the problem with drawing my expensive cards first. Do you think this archetype needs to draw their spells in the correct order more than other archetypes? I think that in general, aggro decks are more likely than control decks to need to draw their cards in the right order, because the game is that they're looking to play is more compact, and they're less likely to have anything that's going to smooth their draw out. So just fewer draws and seeing fewer cards means that everything averages out a little bit less. Of course, there are steps that you can take to minimize your exposure there, such as more aggressively mulliganing and or playing fewer expensive cards in your deck to begin with. But there certainly are a number of 4 and 5 mana cards that this deck really wants to highly prioritize, and there will be spots where if you draw a bunch of those and you don't draw a decent curve, you can run into problems. So I guess I would just say be careful about keeping an opening hand on the strength of a card like Shadowfax or Eomer. While those cards are really, really good, you are an aggressive deck at heart. You do need to make sure, first and foremost, that you're going to curve out, rather than keeping a hand where maybe you have a removal spell, a 4-drop, and a 5-drop or something. You need to really think about whether your deck has enough power that you want to get into that kind of guaranteed late game that hand is setting you up for, and be willing to sometimes mulligan hands even if they have single strong cards in them, if they aren't contributing to playing the kind of game that your deck wants to play. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you again, everyone, for tuning in. Thanks especially to chat for questions. And that's going to be it for this week. I will be back next week with another color combination. And I'll see you then. Bye, everyone.
Prepare for light speed.